Hello, everybody. I'm Julie Wiskirchen from the Tech Talks team. And today, we're very excited to welcome Dr. Krishna Kumar to Google Santa Monica. Dr. Kumar is a senior economist at RAND Corporation, where he leads the Rosenfeld Program on Asian Development at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. His research and teaching interests focus on economic growth and development, human capital accumulation, and technological change. Dr. Kumar joins us today to discuss the economic relationship between India and the United States. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kumar.
Thank you very much for inviting me to interact with this elite audience here. The topic of discussion today is India, and in particular, the implications of the economic rise of India for the United States. In preparing this presentation, I've been informed by three projects that we have done at RAND. One is studying the effect of state-level policies in India on entrepreneurship. The second is a cross-country comparison of Indian and Chinese education system. And the third is a broad study of the future of global poverty. And I would like to acknowledge support from the Rosenfeld Program at RAND, which makes much of my work on Asia possible. So, looking 30 years back, the mention of India would have evoked what kind of images? Probably these delicious, unhealthy, fried snacks from India, samosas, or maybe spirituality. If anybody wanted to find themselves, whether in books or movies or in real life, they would go to India. And unfortunately, the problem of poverty, which has been endemic in India since independence. And it's not as if these images have disappeared, fortunately in the case of samosas, and unfortunately in the case of poverty. And even the recent movie Eat, Pray, Love, the pray was assigned to India, so spirituality is alive and well as well. But India today evokes a different set of images. First, it evokes the image of software companies, both indigenous and foreign companies that are doing business in India. So software and services accounted for over $60 billion in the Indian gross domestic product, or GDP. And while this might be a small percentage of the total Indian GDP, about 6% or so, the influence it has had on the Indian economy and on making the Indian companies players on the global scene is incalculable. Indian software companies export a total of about $50 billion, which is a quarter of India's overall exports, and a good 60% of them are to the United States. Indian labor force, the well-educated labor force that it is known for, is growing every year. 3.5 million graduates and postgraduates are added to the labor force annually, and over 200,000 of them have degrees in IT and computer science alone. The other image that is evoked, in fact, politicians will never let us forget this image, is one of call centers or business process outsourcing. So these are the places where Indians with made-up American names answer your credit card and other reservation inquiries. So this BPO industry has accounted for over $12 billion in revenues for India. And even though there are competitors now going after the same business as India, such as the Philippines, Malaysia, and Thailand, India still retains the top BPO spot in the world. And the recent survey by the management consultancy firm A.T. Kearney ranked India first in global services location based on quality, cost, availability of labor, and so on. The other image that India evokes is actually a country, its neighbor to its north, China. This word, Chindia, which is an unfelicitous coinage, if you will, has been proposed to think of China and India as a whole. These two countries have become joined at their hips, whether they like it or not. So let's spend a quick minute comparing India and China and the U.S. If you look at GDP, gross domestic product, which is sort of like the sales of a country, if you will, the US is over $14 trillion and the #1 economy in the world. China has about a third of it. It was ranked #3 because these figures are for 2009, but as you know, it recently overtook Japan to become the #2 country. And India has over a trillion, about a fourth of the Chinese GDP, ranked at #12. But if you adjust for what is called purchasing power parity, or PPP, to capture the fact that labor and the goods that use labor intensively are cheaper in India and China. So, for example, a dollar is unlikely to fetch you a haircut, even a bad one in the US. But if you convert it to the Indian or Chinese currency, you have a good chance of getting a haircut in these countries. So once you make the adjustment for that, you can see that Chinese GDP is much higher and already ranked #2. It's been ranked #2 for a while. And India is ranked #4 in the world. If you look at the real gross domestic product growth rate, India and China are growing at phenomenal rates, even when the Western countries are still struggling to get out of the recession. And I will get back to this 2 percentage point gap in growth between India and China that you see there. However, when you look at GDP per capita, which is the share of the pie that you get to take home, the figures are not that impressive. China has less than a seventh of the US per capita GDP and ranked much lower, and India has half of China's per capita GDP. So relatively speaking, we are still talking about two countries that are poor. Now, a lot of people have been credited for the turnaround in Indian fortunes, but I would like to acknowledge the writer of Indian origin who actually was born and brought up in Trinidad, but then moved to England, V.S. Naipaul. So V.S. Naipaul traveled in India between 1988 and 1990, and he saw a sense of energy and enthusiasm that he had not seen before, and he saw that this was the beginning of a new way for many millions, a part of India's growth, part of its restoration, and he documented all this in his book, India, A Million Mutinies, in 1990. Whether it was premonition or pure luck, in 1991, India faced a huge crisis, a balance of payment crisis, and India did not let a good crisis go waste. So it enacted a series of reforms which took it from being a closed economy from the point of view of trade. It practiced import substitution. Most of its heavy industries were under state control. It had a high tax rate, and it had all kinds of foreign exchange controls. And it became a country that was much more open and integrated with the world. It lowered and simplified tariffs. It became a signatory to the World Trade Organization, or WTO. Its current account became convertible. The tax laws became much more reasonable. And this process is ongoing. In 2005, India signed a patent law reform which respects intellectual property rights. So all these reforms took India from a very low growth rate. So if you look at the x-axis, it is a calendar year. On the y-axis, you have real gross domestic product, which is adjusted for inflation in trillions of Indian rupees. You can see that before 80, India was growing at 3.5% a year. And it became dubbed the Hindu rate of growth, presumably because Hinduism is a very pacific religion and people were willing to accept this growth rate. But since 80s, reforms started in a small way, which increased the growth rate. And after 91, when reforms were fully enacted, you can see that it made a big difference in growth rate. And in fact, if you look at the more recent years, India has been setting a fairly blistering pace in growth rate, growing at 8 to 10% a year. So you can see that in this graph with those red bars, which are annualized real GDP growth rate, and the line, which is a smoothed average, which goes up much more smoothly. And this points out to one caution we need to exercise in explaining away economic performance based on religion and culture. It's not as if 1.5 billion Chinese and 1.25 billion Indians suddenly converted and became Protestants, and that's why these people started growing. Economic incentives and sound economic policies have a way of, taking effect in the population and improving entrepreneurship. So what does all this mean for the US, which is the meat of the talk? I want to focus on 6 implications. This is not meant to be a complete list. In fact, I'm not even going to focus on the implication that you often hear that India by itself has a middle class that is larger than the population of the U.S. and therefore a ripe market for Western companies. But instead, I want to focus on the perceptions that Americans and Indians have of each other. And after talking about the flow of goodwill, I want to talk about the flow of goods and services, trade, flow of capital in the form of investment, flow of ideas in the form of entrepreneurship, and flow of talent in the form of labor. And then finally, talk about whether the U.S. should think of India and China as a monolith or separately. Okay, so the first and the good news is that Americans and Indians like each other. It was not always this way when, during the time of the Cold War, India was viewed as firmly being in the Soviet camp, even though it was officially a non-aligned country. And many Americans regarded India and Indians with suspicion, and that suspicion was mutual because the Indians were suspicious of the Americans as well. But in a 2005 Pew Global Attitude Survey, among the 17 countries surveyed, Indians had the most favorable opinion of the U.S., about 71%. And the reason I mentioned that particular year is that that was the year when not many people had a very high opinion or a favorable opinion of the U.S. So even in that time, the Indians had a favorable opinion. And since then, consistently, India has been among the top countries, as far as favorable opinion about the U.S. goes. In the most recent survey, 2010, 2/3 view the U.S. favorably. Likewise, in the BBC World Service poll in 2010, U.S. perceptions of India were nearly at the top among 28 countries polled, just a percentage point below South Korea. So this is a good base from which to build on, if you will. Now, looking at trade, if you look at this picture, on the x-axis you have year, and on the y-axis you have billions of dollars in trade. The blue line is U.S. exports to India, and that orange line is U.S. imports from India. And both of these have been, steadily increasing, which is good news. There's been a little bit of a dip in the last year, but that was because of the global economic slowdown and world trade at large slowed down. But just to place this in perspective, if you look at U.S. exports to China, it was about $70 billion, an order of magnitude higher than this. And of course, imports are very high, close to $300 billion. China is the second largest trading partner for the U.S. after Canada, whereas India ranks much lower at number 14. And China is also the largest trading partner for India. And recently, China overtook U.S. as the largest trading partner. But one of the themes that's going to be recurring throughout this presentation is let's get away from just the aggregate and the broad numbers and dig a little bit deeper to look at the composition of these numbers. Okay, so if you look at Indian trade, in this graph on the x-axis, again, you have years. On the y-axis, you have the percentage of trade that is accounted for by services. And if you look at the Chinese line, which is the purple line at the bottom, it's been flat or even decreasing. But Indian share of services in its exports has been steadily increasing, and that is the green line. Okay, so Indian trade is more like a developed country trade, even though in absolute numbers it might be lower than that of China. So a recent report from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, from where this graph is taken, says that globally traded services tend to be knowledge intensive, requiring more educated and productive workers, and Indian exports are much more likely to be at the top end of the services hierarchy. So what are the implications for the U.S.? There's a good reason why Canada is the largest trading partner for the U.S. because it's tightly integrated in the complex production chain that the U.S. has. Some of the goods, intermediate goods, are made in Canada. Some of them are made in the U.S., and then they're put together. So India is likely to have this collaborative possibility with the U.S. rather than just selling lower-end final goods. At the same time, this also gives the chance for India to turn around and compete with some of the goods that the U.S. is making. So this is a slight twist on the aggregate numbers that I showed you. So what can hurt? Well, the protectionist measures that always come to the fore during recessions and slowdowns can clearly hurt this trade flow. So, for example, India recently complained at the WTO that the state of Ohio has imposed a moratorium on IT outsourcing. And clearly, India would be one of the countries that would be affected. What would help is the stalled Doha rounds of trade talks. If those could be revived, not just Indian and U.S. trade, but world trade as a whole will increase. Next, let's look at flow of capital rather than just goods and services. Ernst Young ranks India 4th in attractiveness for foreign direct investment, or FDI. China is ranked number 1. And if you look at this picture, again, on the x-axis year, y-axis billions of dollars of FDI inflow. Before 2005, there was not even much action in India, so I'm just showing the picture from 2005. And you can see that the lower line, which shows the foreign direct investment inflow into India, has been steadily increasing, but again dwarfed by the Chinese figures. Okay, but again, I want to point out, let's look at the composition of it, and services attract over 20% or more of inflows into India, followed by industries such as construction, housing, telecom, and auto. Whereas if you look at the Chinese foreign direct investment stock, a majority of it, close to 60% of it, is concentrated in manufacturing. So clearly the type of foreign direct investment that each country is getting is a bit different. The U.S. investment in India has evolved beyond call centers. So if you look at the picture to the left, this is the result of U.S. multinationals now doing more than just outsourcing. They're doing R&D. They're establishing R&D centers. So the picture there shows the patents that have been filed in India in 2001, 2002, the light orange circle, and the dark orange circle, which is exactly those figure for 2007, 2008. And you can see that both in the number of patents filed in India and granted in India, there's been a huge increase thanks to this increased R&D activity. This is leading to reverse innovation. To your right, you can see the electrocardiogram, a portable version produced for under $1,000 and selling for under $1,000 by GE. And the interesting twist here is that this was designed and developed in India so that the rural physician that you see there who's making house calls can transport it with him. And this is now being adapted to the U.S. and they're planning on marketing it in the U.S. And this is called reverse innovation, and this is going to become the wave of the future. And this is not just a luxury. I think the U.S. firms need to reverse innovate and find how you can sell low-cost products globally, because this is another picture you would have seen, the Tata Nano. It's a car that's priced for $2,200. If the U.S. firms need to compete with these products, they need to engage in a lot of reverse innovation. Now, India signed the global patent laws in 2005, which protects intellectual property, and one of the brightest scenes in the Indian economic landscape is the biopharma industry. Many U.S. institutes and companies have joined ventures in India. India is expected to conduct 15% of the global clinical trials by 2011, netting about $600 million. I think there is a good chance for India and the U.S. using their comparative advantage. When it comes to basic science research, whether it's in universities or research institutes, which are either private or government, the U.S. clearly has the comparative advantage. And India and China and other developing countries might have the comparative advantage in taking these fundamental ideas and translating them into products. And together, that could well be the right win-win formula that is likely to emerge in the near future. So what can hurt here? Indian retail, which is a $300 billion sector, is still largely closed to foreign direct investment. So it's not as if foreign companies are not in India, but they cannot set up multi-brand retail ventures, so they are using all kinds of loopholes and backdoor entry mechanisms to get into the market. So sectors that remain closed will obviously impede capital inflow into India. Indians themselves are becoming adventurous and are investing heavily in other countries. So, for example, the UK is a big recipient of Indian capital, and you've not seen that yet in the US. In the UK, India is the second highest foreign employer after the US, and there's not such an activity happening in the US, and this is probably something that we can expect to pick up in the near future. Now, when we think about India, or when we hear about India in the news, we hear a lot about, rapid growth of India, the software companies and so on, and some of the, rich Indians. So, to your left is a picture which shows that 2 of the top 5 people in the Forbes richest people list are Indians. Mukesh Ambani and Lakshmi Mittal are there at 4 and 5, and there are many others further down the list. But if you look at the broad Indian picture, things are a little bit different. So if you focus on the top panel to your right, the purple part of the pie shows the fraction of labor that is engaged in agriculture, and that is about 60%. Services are about 30%, and industry accounts for the remaining 10%. But if you look at their value added by sector, in other words, what they contribute to the Indian GDP as a whole, agriculture contributes, less than 20%, and most of the value addition is in services, okay, over 50%. Now, this is good from the American point of view for reasons that I mentioned earlier. Indian trade, capital investment looks a lot like a developed country, but it's not clear that it is great from the Indian point of view because a good majority of the Indians have not fully benefited from the opening up and the growth. So our recent research at RAND argues that, inclusive growth has become sort of a mantra in the Indian policy circles, and entrepreneurship might be able to bridge the gap. How? Improvements in infrastructure, education, and health can aid both inclusion and growth. The poor and the rich are both likely to benefit from these improvements. But moreover, entrepreneurship, by its very nature, uses creative approaches to deal with constraints. So even when there are constraints in these sectors like infrastructure and so on, they can work around it even when those sectors are developing. So entrepreneurship is a solution for the here and now. It also spans a huge socioeconomic spectrum, village dweller to venture capitalist. And our research done with the Indian School of Business shows that what India might want to focus on is in developing an overall business-friendly environment rather than trying to give a lot of subsidies which might reach the wrong people and might encourage, wealthy entrepreneurs more than the poor ones. So why should the U.S. care about inclusive growth in India, even if the U.S. does not care about, the benefits reaching to the 60% of the people in agriculture that I mentioned? Protests and social unrest can derail reforms and, push back the gains that have been made in the bilateral trade and investment, which have been increasing, as I just showed. Moreover, the Legatum Institute, which was a sponsor for our research on entrepreneurship, they did a recent survey of entrepreneurs around the world, and they say that the Indian entrepreneur looks a lot like the American entrepreneur. They're risk-taking, and they want to make money and so on, but more importantly, both of them want to make a difference. Okay, so this is not just a perceptions issue, even though Indian entrepreneurs admire and look up to American entrepreneurs, but I think the collaborative possibilities increase if there are that many more Indian entrepreneurs than there are right now. So what can hurt? Clearly India has to improve its business environment. It takes more than 10 procedures to start a business in India compared to Singapore's 3 procedures, as you see on the graph on the left-hand side. And as you see in the chart on the right-hand side, it takes 30 days to start a business in India and only 2 to 3 days in Singapore. So clearly India has to work more on making it easier to start a business. To turn to movement of labor, 30% of the world's software engineers are Indian. I'm sure you have come across them. A third of engineers in Silicon Valley are of Indian descent. As a researcher, Vivek Wadhwa has documented over a 25-year period, over 15% of Silicon Valley companies were founded by engineers of Indian origin. And as the Berkeley researcher Annalise Saxenian has pointed out in her book, The New Argonauts, many of these Indian entrepreneurs have gone back and seeded entrepreneurial ventures in India and in other countries, of course. So the buzzword or buzz phrase, brain drain, has given way to what's called brain circulation now. It's hugely perceived, though, that the U.S. is not very friendly for Indian or foreign entrepreneurs to come and set up shop. So the UK, for example, has this global entrepreneur program, which makes it easier for foreign entrepreneurs, including Indians, to come and set up shop in the UK. Whereas with the U.S., the situation is not similar. And this comes at a time when Indian engineers and entrepreneurs are anyway either staying back in India or returning to India because opportunities there abound, and at least they're much higher than they used to be. Immigration to the U.S. is viewed as being increasingly difficult, and in fact, recently the U.S. proposed increasing the fees for H-1B and L-1 visas. So in addition to complaining about the Ohio IT moratorium on outsourcing, Indians complain to the WTO about the increases in these fees. So these are things that could hurt the flow of talent. So finally, how should India and China be considered? For some reasons, it might actually help to think of them together. If you look at this picture, on the x-axis is the year, and on the y-axis is the PPP, adjusted gross domestic product. The light blue line on the top is American GDP. The purple line or the pink line at the bottom is the Japanese GDP, and the blue one that has grown exponentially is China and India put together. So I call this prosperity regained for these two countries because around 1600, these two countries had the highest per capita GDP in the world. They missed the boat when it came to the first industrial revolution in the 1700 and 1800. But boy, are they catching up in a hurry. And this can only be good news for the whole world because hundreds of millions of people are being lifted out of poverty because of this rapid growth. And if 40% of the humanity benefits, I think it is good for the world as a whole. But from the American point of view, it might still have to deal with India and China, separately because they're very different. India is more service-based, China is manufacturing-based. When we looked at the education, India started focusing on basic education only recently. It's focused much more on higher education, whereas in China, there's much more broad-based literacy and education. And at the risk of oversimplifying, India seeks to be the laboratory to the world, whereas China, a lot of people would claim already is a factory to the world. I mentioned the stubborn 2 percentage point gap that remains between China and India in growth. So people have come up with explanations for it. One of the explanations is that India is a chaotic democracy. It can never get done anything fast. Sometimes that explains things well, but sometimes it's just an excuse. A lot of people say that if infrastructure is attended to, you can bridge the 2% gap. Still other people say that governance in India is poor. The joke in India is that India grows at night when the government is asleep. I think it's a little bit of a harsh assessment given that India did wake up to the potential of its human capital and enacted policies, but there is some truth to the fact that the aspirations of the private sector are growing at a much more rapid rate than how the government can keep pace. So, for example, in the recently concluded Commonwealth Games, or the run-up to it, this issue with infrastructure and governance came into play. To the left is a bridge that collapsed while preparations were being made, and it attracted a lot of negative publicity. But India did bounce back from it and staged what is called a largely acceptable games, including the spectacular opening ceremonies that are showed there. And more interestingly, most analysts and commentators felt that the private sector has not been affected by this negative publicity about the governance and infrastructure, which is good news for India. So in closing, I think India and the U.S. would remain culturally different for a while, but I think all these are going to be dwarfed by the gains that are achievable from win-win situations. Because in 1991, it's not just the policies that changed in India, but the approach to dealing with the rest of the world became a lot more pragmatic. Foreign direct investment was not viewed as another vehicle for philanthropy, and instead people started looking for win-win solutions. So, Prime Minister Singh and President Obama have already met 8 times in the last 18 months. And as you know, President Obama is going to be visiting India in the first week of November. So I think what you've seen from India and the U.S. by way of economic cooperation is just beginning. Thank you very much. Thanks for the great questions and comments. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.